Hi everyone, welcome to your 3.3 video. I really hope you've been enjoying reading while the locust slept. And today our objective is that we're going to start reading chapters 4 and 5, and we're going to analyze something called the two-timeline narrative structure. I hope you have your packet out right now and a pen or a pencil because we are going to be taking some Cornell notes as you watch this video. So what is a narrative structure? This is just a fancy way for describing how a book is organized, and you can kind of think of narrative structure like the map or the outline of a story. So in what order do our events take place? If we think about the play A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry, this play had one timeline narrative structure, where the events happened chronologically. So we started in Act 1, and we found out what was happening in order from the beginning until the end. This is not quite how While the Locust Slept is organized, and you might have already realized that. Our book While the Locust Slept actually has a two-timeline narrative structure, which means that the story is organized using two separate timelines. If we think about pop culture or movies that we've seen, one example of a two-timeline narrative structure is the movie The Princess Bride. So maybe you've seen this or heard of it. This was my dad's favorite movie when I was a kid, so we used to watch it all the time. And this movie actually has two separate stories or two separate timelines going on. It starts off with a grandpa telling his grandson a bedtime story, and it's kind of a fairy tale, and he's reading his grandson this book. And then the movie actually goes to the fairy tale come to life, and we see this story play out as well. And so there's kind of two stories happening within the same movie, and by the end they've come together as one story. In our book While the Locust Slept, let's talk about what the two timelines are that are happening in this book. So first, you've noticed that Peter, our author, is telling us his memories from the state school or the orphanage where he lived for the first 15 years of his life. So he's told us some memories from when he was a young child and when he was growing up at the state school or the orphanage. But you'll also notice that we have a current timeline, and this is Peter telling us about his life after leaving the state school and going to live on the farm placement. So one of the most challenging things about reading this book is keeping track of these two timelines, because Peter doesn't really tell us when he's going to switch from one timeline to the next. That means that we need to use some clues in order to figure out which timeline he's talking about. So I want to show you in this paragraph right here, if we ever see Peter mention the Shawls, so that is John or Emma, that's their last name, the Shawls, or if he's talking about being on a farm, that means we're in the current timeline, his life after the state school, and it means he's about 15 or 16 years old. So those are the names we're looking for that will give us clues we're in the current timeline. For the past timeline, if you ever see references to things like C15 or C16, these are the names of the cottages that Peter lived in at the orphanage. And so seeing things like this tell us he's talking about the state school. He also talks about staff that work at the state school, like Miss Monson or Mrs. Burt. These are all staff that worked at the orphanage he grew up in. So we need to be able to use these clues to keep track of which timeline Peter is talking about. Let's look at what some of the effects are of using a two-timeline narrative structure. Why would Peter Raiser be doing this? One of the main effects is that this creates connections between events. So we can see how the things that happened to Peter as a child at the state school, how they actually end up impacting him when he gets older and goes and works on the farm. We also get to see Peter's reaction to things that happen to him. And so sometimes he's reflecting as he's an older teenager on things that happened at the state school, and we actually get to see Peter's emotional processing or his emotional reaction to things that happened to him. It also really builds our curiosity and the tension of the story, because he will tell us something that happened at the state school and then he'll jump to the farm and we're left wondering how that story ends and what happens next to Peter. Finally, it really helps us follow Peter's train of thought. So when you remember things from your childhood, you might not remember them exactly in chronological order from when you were youngest to when you were oldest. Different things stand out in our memories and feel more important to us or feel connected to other events. And so we really get to see Peter's thought process and his train of thought as he's telling us this important story of his childhood. So these are some of the effects of the two-timeline narrative structure. And now as we read chapters 4 and 5, it's your job to keep track of which timeline we're in as we read. Good luck.